IVM.
Hi, everybody. Just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to yet another episode of All Things Policy. I am your host Apoorv Kumar. Today we will be discussing a very unique aspect of India's constitution. We will be talking about how India's constitution was nurtured and upheld by common Indian people like you and me. Over the past few decades, we have read a lot about the constitution making, India's founding movement, and the works by constitutional scholars who basically argue that the constitution making and imbibing constitutional morality was a top down approach where a few political elites were instrumental in drafting a constitution. Some even argued that most of the features have been borrowed from other constitutions in the world. And it was quite an alien concept to have a constitution in a country like India, where it was the societal norms that were prevailing. In fact, K. Hanumanthayya, a member of the Constitution Assembly, once commented, and I quote, "We wanted the music of the veena or the sitar, but we have the music of an English band." In everyday life too, existing cultural norms are more well entrenched than constitutional values of liberty, equality, and fraternity. You will always hear lines to the effect that the constitution has come into force only in the last 70 years, whereas our cultural values have come down over generations. The tussle between the constitution and the culture has been at the heart of the story of 70 plus years of the Indian Republic. When the constitution was formalized, it was widely believed that it would be made use of by the small educated elite. But what has happened and what we will argue in this episode is that it was common citizens who actually crafted and nurtured India's constitution. People who were from minority communities, marginalized communities like sex workers, and even people from Parsi community, they were the people who actually reached out to the courts of to the high courts and supreme court to sort of uphold the values and the ethos of India's constitution. Today we will be talking about Rohit Day's book People's Constitution, which adds another layer of intellectual inquiry into this aspect. In his book, he describes how the common citizens of India have been instrumental in internalizing constitutional morality and protecting rights and liberties. He probes the role of Indians in constitution making, as in the Indian citizens in constitution making, which is completely, it's kind of an aberration to the whole narrative that it was an elite project. In his book, he argues that it was the day-to-day interactions of normal Indians with the constitution that makes it a people's constitution. The book is actually an ethnographic profile of early litigants who reached out to the Supreme Court and to the high courts in early 50s and 60s to protect their rights and liberties. To discuss this and other themes in the book, I have today with me Suman Joshi. Suman is the program manager for the GCPP at Takshashila, and her interests lie in the interplay between policy and society, among other things. Welcome, Suman.
Hi, Apoorv. Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
If you are interested in topics such as these and others in general, like public policy, governance, politics, and economics, then do sign up for the Graduate Certificate in Public Policy program at Takshashila that starts from 4th of September, and the last date to submit your applications is 28th August. Article 32 allows an individual to approach Supreme Court if she or he believes that her or his fundamental rights have been violated or they need to be enforced. And I think this is one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Ambedkar, who said that Article 32 is actually the heart and soul of Indian Constitution. His exact quote was actually this, and I quote, If I was asked to name any particular article in this constitution as the most important, an article without which this constitution would be a nullity, I could not refer to any other article except this one, Article 32. It is the very soul of the constitution and the very heart of it. Similarly, Article 226 allows any Indian citizen to approach high courts across India if the fundamental rights are violated. The public interest litigation, or the PIL, which became norm after 1970s when the courts and the Supreme Court became slightly activist, widened the scope of citizens approaching the courts. This book talks about these constitutional tools in the hands of common Indians that have deepened our understanding on the Indian Constitution. Suman, let me begin by asking you, what is the central theme of the book and how is it counterintuitive to the whole idea that constitution making was a top-down project?
Yes, Apoorv, thanks again. The central theme of the book, like you have already mentioned, is the role of individuals, common individuals like you and me. And when I say common individuals, it's not just the educated, the ones like us who are, common to an extent, but fairly elitist. When I say common citizens, it means the really lowest class, economic as well as social class of people who have used the constitution to enforce their own rights. So, if you have to look at it from the situation, just dial back to the situation just after independence. I mean, the landscape was of a low level literacy where society was mostly organized on the basis of caste. The idea of a constitution itself was fairly foreign and something that was not understood by most people. Most people went by the rule book of their religion or communities or any such thing. The idea of one constitution across all people was itself, very foreign to the people. From there, if you look at it, the framers of the constitution actually went against the established norm or grain to build the country on the basis of this constitution. So, in that sense, it did not reflect the reality of the people. So, you could say it was a little counterintuitive to the prevailing norms. So, the intuitive way to think about this whole thing would be that since most people don't know what a constitution is, since most people are living their lives by community laws and norms, this constitution will be used only by the elite educated. However, I mean, the humankind never ceases to surprise anybody. Contrary to what was expected, the first challenges to some of the provisions mentioned in the constitution were mounted not by the educated elite, not by the creamy layer of society, but by the lowest, by the most despised minorities, and that went on to shape the constitutional culture in India. The constitution actually provided a toolkit in the hands of the most marginalized, despised communities then, namely the Muslims or the prostitutes. So, in that sense, the idea that the constitution is a project for the elites, by the elites, was taken down by the non elites. So, that way, it is a counterintuitive thing. The entire book, through case laws and things that were not accessible earlier, the author has actually, it's a tremendous effort in just accessing all this information. He has actually gone on to show how the non elites took the constitution for its word and fought for their rights and liberties. So, in that sense, it's a very, very interesting premise that the author puts forward.
That's a very interesting point, Suman, because when I was reading Madhav Khosla's book, India's Founding Movement, in which he argued that India's constitution was actually a kind of a rule of the grammar which was given by the constitution makers to its citizens, right? And here you are arguing that Rohit Day's book says that okay, they understood the rules of the language and the vocabulary, but they use that language and vocabulary to strengthen fundamental rights, protect fundamental rights and civil liberties. So that's a very interesting sort of an aspect. when Granville Austin talks about India's constitution as social revolution, I think we can sort of extrapolate that argument, and we can claim that social revolution came not only from the top but also from the bottom. So I completely agree to your sort of assertion. While reading the book, I couldn't help but notice that most of the litigants, and you have just spoken about the cases and the case laws and the precedents that have been quoted in this book, most of these litigants that the author has profiled in the chapters are those in the early years after independence they approach the courts for economic rights and freedoms and not necessarily for the political freedoms. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that they were challenging states' overreach, but the issues were framed within the language of economics, right? And this is what the author has also argued in the subsequent chapter. In a way, they were trying to signal that the state shall move into the economic lives of citizens, but in a very calibrated manner. There was an overarching state, which we know that Nehru and Ambedkar argued that it's a centralized state that should sort of, define and describe the tragic economic and social trajectory of Indians. But what has also happened is that through these cases, we understand that the citizens said that you can move into our economic lives, but not completely barge into our economic lives. And let's take an example of Muhammad Harif Qureshi versus State of Bihar. This is a case which even Rohit also argues in this book, that it was the butchers from the Qureshi community, a minority community, who mounted a defense based on economic reasoning when they objected cow slaughter. I think so. It was quite a beautiful sort of case study to understand how it was a bottom-up approach and not top-down approach. What was your interpretation when you were going through the other cases, Suman?
Yeah, so the book is primarily focused on, he's taken 4 cases. The first is the Bombay Prohibition Act. The Bombay Prohibition Act is, everybody talks about it. It's fairly well known, okay, where, the state sought to control or to ban the use of alcohol. Okay, now it came from the Gandhian thought, or even the thought about the state is trying to free the people from a Western, since we were just out of the colonial rule. The state was trying to free the citizens out of a Western habit. That was the basis of thinking. However, the Bombay Prohibition Act was challenged by the Parsi community. Parsi community had close links. It affected their economic activity as such because they were linked to the alcohol business. Of course, all of these cases were dismissed on some small technicalities here and there, but it is prudent to note that the Parsi community knew that the constitution, that they could approach the courts with the freedom to practice their profession. Similarly, the Essential Services Act was challenged by the Marwadi businessmen. Again, the Essential Services Act had provided controls, commodity controls, but that had its origins in the wartime shortages, etc. But continuing that, this did not make sense for the Marwadi community. Again, the state here privileged industrial capital over merchants. So this was again challenged by this Marwadi businessman. Again, this formed the basis for administrative law within India. But the most interesting, of course, you have talked already about the Qureshi community and the cow slaughter thing. The most interesting part, of course, for me was the SITA, or the Suppression of Immoral Trafficking Act. This, on the face of it, it sounds very noble, in the sense that you should not allow women to be trafficked. Okay, but however, this was actually challenged by a lady named Husna Bai. She was a prostitute on the grounds that it violated her fundamental right to practice her profession. Now, in a society that is so traditional in terms of the morality thing, her petition was criticized by people across the society, from the feminists to the nationalists. Everybody actually criticized it, saying that invocation of constitutional principles by a prostitute is not done. It just completely outraged them. It was a reflection of their mentality towards these people. So for them, this again meant freedom, again, independence meant that the emergence of a female citizen as a moral, productive member of society. Up until then, the constitution only focused on legislative reforms within the Hindu family fold. Okay, it was very patriarchal in that sense. But this challenge to the Sita, it forced us to look at women on the streets. It was not just the elite women who are cocooned in their protected households that needed to be seen as the thing, but even people on the streets, along with bonded labor, etc., had to be seen as economic agents. They too need a right to practice their profession. They too need a right to earn a livelihood. And that was the premise of her petition. Now, that again, she challenged this on another ground, saying that the courts did not get the into the sexual lives of upper class men who had their own mistresses or other kept women, but this was for regular, the normal prostitutes around. So her contention was that when you are not regulating that, how can you regulate my need for a livelihood? So again, this was not successful, but another consequence of this law was that, or of this challenge, was that it paved the way for mobilizing people, because she also made a petition on behalf of, it was like a class action suit, on behalf of all the prostitutes. Okay, so in that sense, if you see, all four of them affected people and their livelihoods. So I think the need for the challenge came but naturally.
That's very interesting. I think I'm just amazed by the very fact that the citizens' political actions were manifested in constitutional sort of activities like approaching Supreme Courts and High Courts rather than succumbing to non-constitutional activities. I think that is the power of India's constitution, and it was these everyday encounters of these citizens and these common people whom we are talking about that has actually shaped our understanding and our relationship with India's constitution. And I think this is a theme that has been a consistent one throughout the book
Yeah, yeah.
and the chapters, right? Given the fact that all these commoners whom you've been talking about have reposed their faith on Indian judiciary at times when the executive and the political sort of actors turned against them, what would have motivated them to repose their faith on Indian constitution and judiciary? What do you think, Suman?
Yeah, firstly, they were pushed to the brink. Okay, I mean, if your economic rights are violated, how will you make a living? So clearly, that was the first push that they needed. And then I think they found that the constitution is, I mean, I'm sure they did not have the capacity to understand or differentiate between individual rights, group rights, and, they did not know the grammar of the whole thing. But they knew that this constitution is protecting an individual's, rights. So the constitution has put the individual front and center. So by giving us liberty, equality, and fraternity as the cornerstones. So even if they have not read the constitution, even if they have not understood these things, that all these petitions got framed in the language of economic freedom meant that the state had to rethink its role as to how much can it actually come in the way. So the motivation clearly was the economic freedom, and therefore I think it is important to stress that economic freedoms form, I mean, not that one kind of freedom is more important than the other, but just that economic freedom gives the final push to people to actually approach, for redressal of any of your grievances that you have. I think the other thing that it did was to force a rethink of how much can the state actually interfere in your daily lives. Okay, the delicate balance that the state had to draw between protecting people and actually protecting rights of the people also came out very, 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 very poignantly through these 4 cases. It may have taken people back and forth on how much, etc., more discussion, more parleys, etc. But the fact that we had all these discussion and these cases actually forced the state to rethink its role, I think was a remarkable achievement for that time and age.
Right. I think if I may sort of add one unintended consequences of this approach, but that would have sort of developed after several decades, and now it has become quite pervasive and not one of the most productive sort of feature of this approach. Would be the frivolous PILs that people are filing, and that's actually clogging the Indian judicial system. And I think of late, several judges have actually dismissed such PILs owing to the flimsy claims, right? But also
Yeah.
PIL.
But I also think if we sort the larger judicial capacity problem exists everywhere. If you sort the larger judicial problem, I think a lot of this will get taken care of.
That's right. And I think the PILs of late in the past 1 year, they have played a very sort of progressive
Yes.
role. I mean, look at what has happened in case of migrant laborers and oxygen shortages. The Supreme Court and Delhi High Court and Allahabad High Court, the judges actually took suo motu cognizance of those PILs. And they have sort of,
And what
they,
a difference it has made to.
exactly, exactly. I think these were late evenings sort of judgments that were coming out, and I was following up. And there you feel that how these PILs and these institutions that were sort of laid for such situations, they have helped the citizens who were in misery, right?
Yeah.
So I think we should also look at the positive side of the story as well. I think this book should be widely read since this is a departure from the very conventional scholarship on Indian constitution and constitution making. Because earlier these scholars would focus on the early years of constitution making, drafting of the constitution, about constituent assembly debates, about constitution makers. Then what happened is that in 70s, when the role of Supreme Court became quite prominent, then some of these scholars moved to the Supreme Court. They started writing about the Supreme Court and its role post-emergency in 1975. This book is slight departure because here we can see how the constitution making had citizens also to play a very significant and important role.
Yeah, I think the takeaway also is that the project constitutionalism is something that we can never give up on. It has to be a moving project all the time, and we need to make our claims through the constitution.
That's right. I think that's the right word, make our claims, right? I think that was was a brilliant sort of add-on to our conversation, Suman. Thank you so much, Suman, for this conversation. I had a lovely time talking to you.
Thanks, Apurv. I hope everybody reads the book. It's a fantastic take on our times.
Thank you all. And if you are interested in such conversations and such topics, then do sign up for our GCPP program. The application process is live. The last date to apply is 28th of August. Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Would like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Cred, Ciet, and Global Victoria. Thank you so much for making this possible. On Cyrus Says, Cyrus is joined by the hilarious and extremely charming illusionist and therapist Suhani Shah. They talk about different aspects of magic like sleight of hand, mind reading, mentalism, and more. The Habit Coach completed 500 episodes, 500, and Ashton has a special message for us on the occasion. Do check that out. We had Lekini Desai, founder of the India Ethnic Company, talk to Varun Digarala about their story and the Hutke marketing idea that made them popular. On Naan Curry, South Africa just celebrated World Chocolate Day. They took us through the origins, history, economics of chocolate, and shared their memories. On Tere Mere Raste, Keshu Chaturvedi shares an interesting story from Leh. check out an updated version of the Traveling Professor's Diary. It's now rechristened as Smarter with Sid. Same old brain filled with news stories and insights. This time, listening to know why you should keep things simple. And finally, check out Global Victoria Tech Talks. This one is in partnership with Global Victoria, the trade arm of the Government of Victoria and Australia. The edtech and gaming industries are booming in Victoria, Australia, and this series is meant to showcase that. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Want to learn something new and have a few minutes to spare? Well, then go for the Traveling Professor's Diary, where I, Siddharth Deshmukh, the Traveling Professor, will help you glean from all the insights that I've gained from wherever I've traveled, learned, taught, and repeated. Join me every Tuesday and Thursday on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcasts from.